We'll start with the original assertion from David Rubin that systemic racism doesn't exist because there are no laws that favor one race over another. The first question to ask is that what systemic racism is? Laws that explicitly favor one race over another? No, of course not. In fact, many scholars define racism itself as a system. For starters, there is the fact that many of the laws that make racial discrimination illegal are often broken and not well enforced. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, reminder, recently gutted by the Supreme Court, granted certain protections in an attempt to make sure that black people were able to exercise their right to vote, including a pre-clearance provision, which would have likely prevented the recent debacle in Georgia. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't still happen. States across the country have enacted laws that courts have eventually found to be racially discriminatory. But often those laws aren't overturned until years of legal battles, long after the intended effect has already had the result of disenfranchising black voters. The impact of these policies, that include voter suppression and racist gerrymandering, is evident in states like North Carolina, one of 3 states in 2018 where the GOP lost the popular vote, but somehow still managed to win a majority in the state House of Representatives. You know, the same way a racist president won through the verifiably racist and undemocratic electoral college system. Now, second, laws don't need to mention race at all to be oppressive towards black people. The Constitution doesn't even use the word slave until the 13th Amendment, the one that freed the enslaved people. And before that, it's not like we didn't have a system of slavery in this country. It's like a law needs to use the N-word for Dave and this grubby group of geeks to consider it to be a part of systemic racism. There have been many laws since the 1960s that have specifically disadvantaged black people without explicitly referencing race at all. This country is very good at doing that. It's like our superpower. Consider the fact that for decades, there was a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, despite the fact that they are both made from essentially the same substance and the dangers and addiction levels are incredibly similar. You know what was different? Black people were more likely to get arrested and incarcerated for using crack than white people, despite equal use. In 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act changed this disparity, but the ratio is still 18-to-1. So, thanks, Joe Biden? In fact, as David himself inexplicably noted, immediately following his rejection of the existence of systemic racism, the war on drugs puts black people in jail at far higher rates for non-violent drug crimes, despite the fact that white people and black people use and sell drugs at the same rates. Also, thanks, Joe Biden, for being better than Donald Trump. You did it. Congratulations. You hopped over that bar. And as with many components of systemic racism, the negative impact of laws like these on people's lives are compounded by other racist laws. Getting swept up into the criminal justice system for a nonviolent drug crime can mean that you lose your right to vote and that you have to check a box on a job application indicating that you are a felon. And you can be barred from certain government services like public housing. But as Dave says, that has to do with more socioeconomic reasoning. So let's talk about those socioeconomic reasons, Dave. Because as I mentioned, laws that explicitly favor one race over another is not the definition of systemic racism. Systems are comprised of many components, not just laws. For example, there are policies that govern everything from your workplace to local municipalities all the way up to the federal government that are not laws, but are very much a part of systemic racism in America and greatly impact the socioeconomic status of black people. For example, the system of wealth accumulation has created perhaps the most persistent, insidious, and consequential legacy when it comes to the history of systemic racism in this country, resulting in a staggering disparity between white people and black people. But is it, as Ben Shapiro claims, because of black culture? No, but let's first consider the fact that the majority of the wealth that people accumulate over their lifetimes comes from 2 places: inheritance and home ownership. considering black people were enslaved for over 200 years, meaning they were not paid for their labor, and then lived under Jim Crow segregation laws for the next 90 years, I would say that it has been pretty hard for black people to accumulate wealth via inheritance under those conditions. And this is not ancient history. I mean, there are people alive today whose parents were enslaved. So how about home ownership? Well, let's listen to what Richard Rothstein, author of a book, The Color of Law, has to say about the way housing policy has been implemented in this country.
And the reason is another federal program run by the Federal Housing Administration that subsidized the movement of white families out of central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs that were exclusively white. So the federal government guaranteed loans to mass production builders. The most famous example, perhaps, is Levittown. Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. He got loans guaranteed by the federal government on explicit condition, I want to emphasize that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home in the development had to have a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans.
The white Americans who were given government-backed mortgages for homes under this policy paid less per month to own a home than what black Americans paid for rent in public housing during this period. Those homes have since increased in value, netting those families $200,000 to $300,000 of added wealth. So, is the racial wealth gap really a result of black culture?
African American income on average is about 60% of white income. African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. Most families in this country gain their wealth through housing equity. This enormous difference between 60% income ratio and 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. So the wealth gap, I think, is attributable to this residential segregation.
It is obvious that a huge part of the racial wealth gap can be attributed to the federally sanctioned housing policies of this country, which included redlining, a means by which loans were explicitly and intentionally denied to individuals in black, redlined neighborhoods, and where state-backed restrictive covenants denied black people the opportunity to move into wealthier white neighborhoods. And so not only were black people not able to inherit wealth from their parents and grandparents, who were enslaved, but they were denied the opportunity to build wealth for themselves. It wasn't until 1977 that discrimination in lending for housing was outlawed. This meant that black people were relegated into living in areas of highly concentrated poverty with elevated levels of pollution due to their proximity to freeways and toxic facilities, which caused lower life expectancy and a lack of access to upward mobility. And insidiously, the racist segregation policies that created this concentrated poverty also led to over-policing, which led to mass incarceration, which led to the loss of political power, which meant that these communities were not equipped with the political power to oppose the creation of big polluters, which led to even further loss of property values, which led to less funding for education, which led to. So given this, it's not that surprising that 1 in 7 white families today are millionaires compared to 1 in 50 black families. Or that while single white women between the ages of 36 to 49 have a median net worth of $42,000, and single black women in this same age range have a median net worth of $5. As Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the 1619 Project, recently noted on the Ezra Klein Show,
what the census data shows is that actually lower income white Americans have more wealth than middle class black Americans, and lower income white Americans live in wealthier neighborhoods than middle income black Americans.
This is all so weird, you know? It's almost as if the racial inequality we see in this country is not caused by black culture, but by some sort of like a system, some sort of system that seems to involve a race somehow that gave white people some sort of like, I don't want to call it privilege, but I do, because that's what it is. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.